Hello and welcome to Biblical Breadcrumbs, where today we are dealing with something very exciting. We're starting into the next class, which is going to be how to read the Bible. That's what I'm going to cover on Sunday mornings, the next few or however many it takes to actually cover an appropriate standard of how to read the Bible. Do we not know how to read the Bible? No, not usually. We'll talk about that in a minute. This is coming from, if you want a kind of source book, source material on this is coming from a book that I'm going through. I read through it for a while ago for my while I was in training doing some preaching stuff. How to Read the Bible for All It's Worth by Gordon Fee and Douglas Stewart. This is the second edition. This is a book that basically just covers a bunch of different aspects of how you should actually be reading the Bible. Very important stuff. I will say in this book, I don't agree with everything that's in it. I actually actively disagree with several things that are in it, such as one of the things they do when they talk about Bible translations, which we'll do in a little bit here. They talk about how the NIV is basically the best translation you're going to get, which I heartily disagree with. I do not like the NIV. It's fine in many circumstances, but that's it. It is far from the best version you're going to get. They say it's like a good balance between different things. I don't really think it is. And so I disagree with that. I will bring up what they say in the book because there is some legitimacy to everything that they're saying, but I do disagree with several of their points, that being one of them. If I were to recommend a Bible to somebody, it would not be the NIV. But, we're just a little bit different like that. So, if you like a source book on this, then this is, in general, a pretty good book. Again, I disagree with some of the specific points in it because I disagree to some extent with every person who exists in the world, so I shouldn't be surprised when I don't agree 100% with everything that's in a book. I'd say we're 90% in agreement. There are a few things that are like, I don't think that's right. Some things that they overstate. There's a lot in the opening chapters about the role of women that I think they misunderstand. They're using that as a picture of trying to interpret things and trying to interpret them correctly, and they're interpreting them incorrectly. But that's a discussion for a different day when we do a class on that. So, How to Read the Bible for All It's Worth by Fee and Stewart. Fairly good material overall. If you're interested in reading something like that. I also have here How to Read the Bible as Literature by a guy named Leland Ryken. He's written a few different books like this on how to read the Bible or stuff that's in the Bible or what have you. This is much less approachable. This is a more technical book and it's more wordy. So if you're not into that kind of thing, this is going to be more difficult to get through. But I think I'm generally more in agreement with the things he says than the things that they say. So 95% agreement. I don't remember anything specifically that I disagree with, but I'm sure there's something in there. So we'll just leave that out and let that be up to interpretation as it goes. The other thing to say is, as much as I am using those books to try and format some class material, I'm basically taking the topics list from the first one, How to Read the Bible for All It's Worth, and then supplementing some material in from How to Read the Bible as Literature, because I think there are other considerations that Ryken has that are good to think about. As much as there are those, I also have my own physical notes, and if you can see this on the screen, which you may not be able to, the first two entire sections of the class are summed up in these first 2 lines, these first 5 lines in total. And then we actually get into some other stuff. And so I don't even know how to do this class, how to post notes for this class. The notes for this class may either be literally 5 lines of what I have written on the paper, or I have a PowerPoint that goes into more details and gives some illustrations. And so that maybe I'll find a way to post that into the Substack notes if you are interested in that. Otherwise, just email me. I'm sure my email floats around somewhere, and I can send you the PowerPoint that way. I swear it's not a virus, I think, as far as I know. Hasn't broken my stuff yet. So, but I'm putting that together. So if that's helpful for you, then by all means, let me know, and I'll try to send that over. How to read the Bible is a weird topic to kind of open. You ask, how do you read the Bible? And the answer is top to bottom, left to right, right? like every other book. we live in a society where everybody knows how to read generally. I mean, they're always right. There are a few outliers who don't know how to read or don't know how to write or whatever. Sign your name with an X instead of an actual signature, whatever, right? General rule is 21st century America. You know how to read, even if you don't do it all that often, even if your concentration span is not that great, even if you prefer watching stuff or listening to an audiobook or whatever, you know how to read. Even if you are listening to an audiobook, this still applies there. Even if you're watching a movie, a lot of this still applies there. Do we not know how to read? Do we not know how to understand what's being told to us? And the answer to that question is no. A lot of times. Do we not know how to read? No. Do we know how to read? No. You don't know how to read. A lot of people like saying, I am literate. I know what the letters are. I can sound out the words, or maybe I can even look them up in the dictionary. Therefore, I know how to read. And the answer is no, because if you think reading is just a matter of looking at a word and being able to tell what the word means, you've missed a lot of the point of reading. Reading is a lot more complicated than that. And so maybe we would say, even if you do know how to read, right? Even if you do know how to do the physical act of reading, of translating words into sounds, of translating those sounds into something that means something in your head, even if you know how to do those technical aspects of it, you don't know how to read. Or even if you do, you can't consciously explain to me the process of reading, because reading is very complicated. As you go through, it gets more and more obvious. Reading is not an easy thing to try and do. You have what you're doing when you're reading is you are taking noises, sounds, words, meanings. You're taking those things, and then you're taking them into your head and trying to make them mean something to you, which is fundamentally a task of interpretation. Interpretation is where we start this conversation with the question, do you need to interpret what you read? The answer is yes, sort of. I mean, I don't really know what else to say. The answer is kind of yes, right? Do I need to interpret what I read? Sort of. I wouldn't say yes, you need to interpret what you read. I would instead say you're going to interpret what you read. You are going to interpret these things. You need to do it properly. And that's kind of, a lot of people are, confused on what that looks like or what exactly that means. Books, movies, video games, whatever it is that you are experiencing, you need to think about that for just a second. There is, behind every movie, there is a director who has put this together. There is the actual movie itself that has been made. And then there is your experience with the movie that has been made. These mean three different things. A movie exists, right? The physical bounds of the movie exist. The movie is limited. The movie cannot do all these things for you, but the movie exists in itself. There is kind of the objective fact that it does exist. The director's intention behind the movie, the authorial intent is sometimes what it's called, that may be different than what actually exists, because the director may be thinking something, and then he makes a movie based on that, and the movie does not communicate what he wants it to. But the director wanted you to see the movie and think something, even if he miscommunicated that. And then there is, on top of that, there's my interpretation of it, where I watch the movie, and maybe I even get an insight into what the director wanted me to see, but then as I watch the movie, maybe I see it, or maybe I don't. I was watching Star Trek The Next Generation the other day, because it's absolutely excellent. After you skip most of Season 1, it's absolutely excellent. I was watching in Season 2 the other day, and there was an episode, something, they were going to die. And so there was a question of what do you do when you die? Like, what happens when you die? Data asked Picard this. And Picard said, a lot of people think you just kind of go to a garden forever when you die. And some people think you just stop existing, right? basically a very, very summarized view of heaven, an oversimplified view of heaven, which I don't think is accurate, or annihilationism, which I also don't think is accurate. And Picard, Data said, well, which one do you believe? And Picard said, I think it's more than that. If your existence just ends up as one of those two things, then you kind of miss the point. Like, there's so much more to existence than just either living in a garden forever or not existing anymore. Like, I don't know exactly what happens, but there's a whole lot more there. That episode exists in its own way. When I watch that episode, I can see a good point there. Because I don't think heaven is just an eternal garden that you hang out in forever. Heaven is a place where you work. Heaven is a place where you glorify God. Heaven is a place where you live in the presence of God for all eternity. What does that look like? I don't know, but it's not just sitting around in a garden forever. That is a gross underestimation of what heaven would be. But I also don't believe in annihilationism. I think that Picard is right when you say there's a lot more to life than just ending up in nothing, or just, I guess, like, it's just kind of generally happy. There's so much more. I agree with that as a Christian. I have no idea what the author meant for me to experience when he wrote that. I don't know. I don't know who the writer was. I don't know what he believes. It could be that he believes in annihilationism, and yet he wrote something else in as a character moment for Picard that you're not supposed to agree with. Maybe he wrote something in that you are supposed to agree with. Maybe Picard is supposed to be talking about how we live on in the memories of the people that we touch, and the loved ones that we have, and we live on in their memories forever. That could be what was supposed to be meant. But I got a message from heaven, or about heaven out of it. Maybe I totally misinterpreted what was there, but I saw it and I had my interpretation. The objective reality of the show exists. What the author was trying to communicate exists. My interpretation of what the author was trying to communicate exists. Or maybe my interpretation is just what the show was, because I don't know what the author was trying to communicate. I'm not trying to interpret what the author was trying to communicate to me. Or maybe I am. It's a very complicated question, but I hope it serves to illustrate that point. Interpretation is going to happen, whether you want it to or not. This is not something where you can read it and just read absolutely objectively and not read yourself into it at all, and there's never going to be anything like that. As soon as you start asking the question, what does that mean? That's interpretation. And unless you watch your shows and merely observe the things that happen and never think about any of them, never make any application towards yourself, never consider anything that's really being said, unless you are watching or reading something in an absolute void where it never means anything to you, then you're going to interpret. For instance, when you go to the Bible, the idea of the cross. What does the cross mean to you? Well, I don't know. I don't know what people will answer. I'll ask that question on Sunday, and we'll see. A lot of people, when you look at the cross, you think of Christianity. A lot of people, when you look at the cross, think about sacrifice. It's the sacrifice of Jesus, the glory of Jesus. It could be a glory. It could be a burden. You have to bear your cross. Take up your cross and follow me, right? That's what Jesus said. A lot of people, when they look at the cross, they just think of Jesus because that's the thing that Jesus used, right? That's the thing. Did you know those are all interpretations of what the cross actually is? What the cross is, when you break it down objectively, what the cross is in the Roman world is a symbol of execution. It is an execution. It is a criminal who deserves to die, and so the Romans put him up on a cross, and they kill him. That's what the cross is. But when we read the cross today, when we see the cross somewhere, if somebody has a cross necklace on, you don't look at them and say, wow, a criminal got executed. You look at them and say, oh, they're a Christian. Well, that's kind of interpretation, isn't it? When you look at a cross on a church building or in a church building somewhere or in a piece of artwork somewhere, you understand something about Christianity, about sacrifice, about Jesus, about all these good things. But in actuality, what the cross means is death and execution. Justified execution, actually, is what it means. But Jesus changed that, didn't he? And nowadays, when we read and when we see the cross nowadays in the 21st century, especially in America, we look at that and we say, wow, what a good thing. In the olden days, it was never a good thing until Jesus came and changed it. There's a reason in the New Testament they refer to the cross being the stumbling block for people, because the cross means execution. The cross means a crime has been committed. The cross means justified, to some extent, there has been a justified execution. Now, it could be, people get staked up on crosses for crimes that don't really deserve death just so that the Romans can make a point. And so you could argue that it's not really justified. But the point is, there has been a crime committed, and the cross is the punishment for the crime. But not anymore. When we read it today, that's not what it means anymore. When we read it today, there's a reason the New Testament talks about it as the stumbling block, because people look at the cross and they say, you're following a criminal, right? You're listening to a guy who committed crimes against the government and got himself executed for it. Do you really think that's a good idea? You're following after someone who has done evil. Why would I follow after a person like that? It's a stumbling block to the Jews and the Gentiles. There's a reason it's described like that. Even when you read the idea of a cross, most people have the image of a cross being, that's terrible. Oh, that's terrible. My PowerPoint is being silly. Maybe I'm just goofy. When you even have the idea of a cross, what you have is, most people think of it as like the lowercase t shape, right? A straight line up and then a line 3/4 of the way up that crosses over it. And so there's a little bit jutting out at the top, and then there's the crossbar for like the arms to be pinned to, and then the legs are pinned lower down on the body. In reality, the cross at that time was probably a lowercase or an uppercase T shape. It was probably something like that, where the plaque would have been pinned to the middle of the T, and the arms would have been hung up because the head is already way down low. You have the arms reaching up in that direction, and then that's the rest of it. It was not a lowercase T shape with a stubby little bit at the top. It was probably flat on the top. Even when you read cross, you read 3 crosses on a hill. How often have you seen the 3 lowercase t shadows on the hill? You've never seen the 3 uppercase t's on a hill, because that's not what we think of. When we read the word cross, we have this connotation with it, but that's not the actual connotation that it has, or that it probably had. I'll add probably. It was potentially, it could have been the lowercase t shape, but instead it was probably a capital T, is how I would put that. When we read about a cross in the New Testament, a lot of times we're envisioning the wrong thing. That's interpretation, right? That's something we interpret. We see it one way, but it's not actually that way. You have other questions, right? What does flesh mean? When you read flesh in the New Testament, what exactly does that mean? Flesh, well, it could mean physical flesh. It could mean the physical body. But a lot of times when Paul is writing in the New Testament, he'll talk about flesh versus spirit. In other words, flesh being the symptom of a spiritual disease, of an unfaithfulness, of a going against God and fighting against God instead of being faithful. What does flesh mean? Well, I don't know. And when you read the New Testament, when you come across flesh, whoever eats my flesh and drinks my blood, is that whoever eats my physical body and drinks my physical blood, or is that a spiritual thing? In John 6, I think it is. Catholics would take it as a physical thing, where what's it called? Transubstantiation theory, where Jesus, when the bread and cup are blessed by a priest, the bread and cup actually transform into the literal body and blood of Jesus. I disagree with that based on a few things, primary of which being there is no such thing as a specific priesthood, given that all Christians are priests. I had an elder jump scare at the door, so I kind of forgot what I was just saying. But disagree with transubstantiation because there is no priesthood to bless the objects into physical body versus spiritual body, right? there isn't that kind of transfer going on at the very least. Now, it could be, there are other passages, it could be that there is a physical body, and it just by myself, when I eat it, it does transform into the physical body of Jesus. I don't think it does. I think the flesh there is spiritual, but that's a question of interpretation. And there are other things, there are a bunch of things you can read that help inform your interpretation, but that's going to come down to interpretation. The word flesh in some instances does mean physical. The word flesh in other instances does mean spiritual. We have to use our interpretation to try and figure out what is actually meant. And so we're dealing with, I can't do my PowerPoint because it doesn't move over. Anyway, we're dealing with interpretation is trying to find really the ultimate meaning of things, is trying to drill down and actually understand the meat that's on the proverbial bone over there. Interpretation is trying to figure out what things actually mean. But even so, you have to be careful with interpretation, because as much as you're trying to find the meaning to something, you have to keep in mind the Bible has two different meanings for the things that it is saying. There is a meaning for back then, and there is a meaning for now. This is not to say the whole thing is cultural, so I have questions about it and I don't really believe in it. Like, not to say any of those things, right? I'm not trying to impose a bunch of heresy there. But there is a meaning that we would get for us today, and there is a meaning that they would get for them back in the day. We have to figure out how to read the Bible like they would have heard it, so that we can understand the applications that they would have made, so that the applications that we would make today are actually factual and what God meant for us to take from the text. The Bible is not culturally bound, but there are a lot of things that meant something in their culture and, don't mean that thing in ours. I had a friend who was teaching Ezekiel chapter 1, and it came up. He was talking about the four living creatures that are bearing the throne of God. Living creatures who are kind of animal, kind of man. They're angel things with different faces. Faces of a human or a bull or a lion or an eagle, I think, are the four in Ezekiel. I think they're four in Ezekiel. They're also four in Isaiah, and I forget which one is which. And he made the point, Ezekiel is sitting in Babylon right now. Babylon is full of statues, like you'd be more familiar probably with the Assyrian statues of the sphinxes with like human faces, right? The creatures with lion bodies and then eagle wings and then the head of a king or whatever it is. They would be familiar with that kind of a setup. And so for Ezekiel, he's looking around his society and he's seeing all these weird angel human hybrid, like monsters with human heads, and that's very, very odd. And then God shows up to him in a vision, and in the vision, the base level is these monsters, these creatures with human heads on them, and then God is putting himself above all of those things. Does that mean, if I read that today, Ezekiel 1, I've always read it before he brought that up. I've always read it as, these are what the angels look like, right? The angels look like beasts with strange human heads. Okay. They're the cherubim who are carrying his chariot specifically. Those ones look like that. I don't know that that's actually the case. It could be, right? If I saw it today, would I see, if I got to see the chariot of God, which I very much doubt I would, and I don't know that my human psyche could take it, but if I ever go absolutely insane, then maybe that's what's happened. If I got to see that today, would I see them in the same way? Or would I just see angels, right? Because the angels I'm familiar with are human beings in white with wings and halos and maybe harps, right? That's the kind of picture of angel that I generally have in my head, even though I've tried to educate myself better. That's kind of the American concept of an angel versus the Babylonian concept of an angel as these horrific beings with all these wings covering themselves and various different heads. If Ezekiel sees it as the Babylonian concept, maybe I would see it as an American concept. Maybe it's just trying to communicate the idea that God is above the powers of this world. It could be that it's communicating the idea God is above the cherubim, and here are what the cherubim actually look like. That could be. But it could also be that it's communicating the idea God is above all the powers in this world. This is what you think the power in the world looks like? Okay, God is above that. And maybe that little detail is culturally specific, but the overall point being made isn't. Interpretation is the practice of trying to find that kind of meaning, because there is a meaning that they would have seen then that has ramifications and implications for the meaning that we would receive now. Do you need to interpret? I don't really care if you need to. You will interpret. Be careful how you interpret. And that's kind of what this class is talking about. Now, who reads the Bible? Is a question. If there's a meaning for then and a meaning for now, we have to figure out first, okay, who is supposed to be reading the Bible? Is the Bible written for you? And the answer is, yeah, of course the Bible's written for me, right? It is eternally relevant. It is just as relevant for me as it was for Paul, as it was for Moses, right? It is just as relevant for me today as it was back when it was written. The Bible is written for me to benefit from. The Bible is written for all of us to benefit from. But is the Bible written to you? And the answer to that is, of course not. It is eternally relevant. It has a long-range kind of view on who's going to benefit from it. But it's also historically particular in terms of who was it written to, when was it written, what was it written about, what was the time period. There is a difference in between those two, and we need to remember to recognize it. The Bible is not written to you in the 21st century. The message to the Ephesians is not written to the church in wherever it is that you live in 2026. The message to the Ephesians is written to the church in Ephesus around the year 60 or so, maybe a little after, a little before, something like that. It's written somewhere around that time period. They're ruled by Rome. They have a Roman governor. They're living in a Gentile province with Jewish and Gentile opposition to the church that exists. They have a small church there. Probably Timothy is preaching for them or evangelizing in the area at or around that time frame. He was sent by Paul to go and work in that area. They have specific people there. Paul knows specific people there. He's writing to try and influence them in a particular way. The Bible is not written to you, but the Bible is written for your benefit. You sometimes hear this word called exegesis that floats around every now and then. Exegesis is just the idea of trying to get into the text and hear it as the readers, as the original hearers heard it. You get to read the text like the original people would, so that you understand what the original people would have understood. That's the idea. You have exegesis, and you got to make sure you're doing it in all passages. Sometimes we read the Bible in the 21st century way, and we read it to make application for us Christians. We read it kind of devotionally, and then when we come upon a problem passage or a question we're not exactly sure what to do with, then we delve into how they would have heard it. And we figure out how they would have heard that one answer and then say, oh, so that's the answer. That's the thing they were going to get. And then the next verse, when we're back to comfortable ground, we're back to just reading it devotionally for the 21st century Christian instead of actually reading it and trying to tell. You have to learn to do exegesis in everything, to learn to read as the readers read it, to learn to hear as the hearers heard it, the original group, and then make that application from those things instead of just reading it as you would today and trying to get something else out of it. Boiling a young goat in its mother's milk is condemned in the Old Testament. If you want to read that as a 21st century Christian, it means, don't boil a young goat in its mother's milk. Okay, fine. I don't cook goat anyway. Whatever, right? That doesn't really mean anything. But if you were to actually delve back into how they would have heard it, then you probably have a much more interesting interpretation. I've heard a few different things. I'm not exactly sure which way to go with on that. It could be that it's the idea that the mother should not be involved in killing the child, right? There's an idea of provision there. You shouldn't take what is good and used for the life of a child and then use it to kill a child. That's not proper. That could be one interpretation. You could do several different things with that. I'm not exactly sure how they would have heard it back in the day. You have to get back in their head to figure out what they heard before you can actually start figuring things out yourself. Don't be selective in how you exegete a text and how you use your exegesis, but instead remember the context of what you're dealing with so that you understand what you're speaking on. Speaking of context, you need to remember to keep the context. If you are going to read the Bible, this is a fundamental rule, and we'll deal with this more in every individual later section when we're talking about Old Testament narratives. There's a certain context that the Old Testament narratives fall into. There's a certain context Old Testament prophecy falls into, or the poetry, or the wisdom literature. There's a certain context that Jesus's bios fall into, the gospel stories as you know them. There's a certain context for those, but we need to talk about context in general. When you are reading the Bible, it is not enough to just read your section of the Bible. If you just read a couple of verses and say, "Oh, that was neat," and then you head on your own way, you've probably missed the greater point that was being made in the conversation. You have to keep the context of what's being said. And again, by the way, I don't know how I'm going to post notes for this. The first line of my notes says, "Do we need to interpret what we read?" The second line of my notes is about translations and what translation you should use. So we haven't even gotten to the second line of my notes yet. This is why my notes are terrible. And this is why I have a PowerPoint that's telling me things to keep in mind so that hopefully that becomes a good record for people to keep track of. Keep the context. You need to keep historical context. If the book was written to people in the Roman Republic, allegedly, Democratic Republic, the Roman dictatorship, right? If it was written to people in the Roman Caesar area, they are going to be dealing with some things that we are not dealing with. The Roman Caesars had a lot less checks and balances than American presidents do. I know that a lot of people say American presidents are just kind of doing whatever it is they want to. Both sides have argued that over the past 10, 20 years or whatever, and both sides are kind of right. But still, it's nothing compared to Nero going out and hunting down all the Christians and turning them into candles to light his dinner parties just because he could. We're not at that point. They were dealing with a much harsher government than we are. When you read a command in Romans 13, which is obey the government, I know they're not great all the time, but you need to obey the government. Paul was talking about a lot worse of a government than we have. But you need to obey the government in that situation. How much more do we need to obey ours? When Paul was talking in Romans 13, and he says, obey the government, America has a very different government. We need to obey it, but we do have a very different government. If you disagreed with a Roman policy, what could you do about it? Nothing. If you disagree with an American policy, you can file a complaint. You can file a lawsuit. You can, you can do all sorts of things. You can protest peacefully, not violently, but you can protest. You have some amount of right to protest and let your voice be heard. You can definitely vote for the people that you prefer to get in office so that they make decisions that you prefer. If you don't like the king, you can vote and elect another king in 4 years. That's a thing. You couldn't do that in ancient Rome. You can do that in America. Keep this context. The general rule is you should be obedient, even to the most awful of governments, but part of our government allows us to make choices about it. Okay. Then go make those choices within the bounds that you've been given. You can make those choices. Historical context. When you read Romans 13, Paul is not talking about Paul is not talking about obedience to a government when it does what you like. Paul is talking about obedience to one of the most abusive governments that's ever been, but you're going to obey that anyway. So how much more should we obey the ones that are much, much nicer to us, especially to us as Christians? Keep the context. Historical context, very important, and it will inform a lot of things that you're talking about. Conquering the land of Canaan. God has not commanded modern-day Christians to go anywhere and to kill anybody. God did command ancient Israel, in this one instance, to go into the land of Canaan and eradicate the people who were in there because they were evil people who were doing horrific things to themselves, to their children, to their neighbors, and everyone around. These are the people who are murdering all their children via child sacrifice. Yes, you can kill those people, Israel. Go in and kill them. But people who read the book of Joshua and then say, Christians should go in and cleanse some land, right? You've totally missed the point because you didn't get the historical context. Be careful of what the history says. Historical context will deal with time and culture. It will deal with earthly powers. It will deal with major figures, kings in the world, whoever is in charge at that time, whether it be Egypt or Babylon, Assyria, not in that order, Egypt, Assyria, Babylon, Persia, Medo-Persia, technically. It's just Persia, Greece, and then Rome. The context is going to change based on who's in charge. The context is going to change based on who's the king. The context is going to change based on where the country was at that moment. Be careful that you read the historical context properly. You also need to read the testamental context properly. Old versus new. When you read the Bible, you have Old Testament, you have New Testament. Those are two very different things. You have Israel and their commands, and then you have the Christian commands, right? Which one am I supposed to do? Well, are you Israel or are you the Christian? Then be a Christian, right? Do not follow the Old Testament commands to the same degree that you follow the New Testament commands. The Old Testament says if you build a house, you have to put a parapet around your roof, a railing around your roof to make sure that people don't fall off it. Has anyone ever done that today? Right? If you own a house, have you built a parapet around your roof? If you're in an apartment, have you insisted that the people put in a parapet around your roof to make sure that nobody falls off the roof? Probably not, because back in those days, historically, historical context for this would be back in those days they used to have flat roofs. They would spread out food on the roofs for it to dry. They would use it as storage space. They would use it for all sorts of things. They would live up there. If you didn't have any rails in the place that people generally walked, then they could well fall and hurt themselves. Historical context, people. Go build a railing on your roof so that people can't just run around and fall off and kill themselves. Christian context, the modern day, we don't really walk on our roofs that much. There's not really a reason to build a railing on a roof, right? So there's historical context for that. The other thing is testamental context. God commanded people build a railing on the roofs in the Old Testament. God has not commanded Christians to build anything on their roofs. I don't need to listen to it, right? The Old Testament does not bind me to the same extent that the New Testament does. And if you read the Old Testament like it's commanding things, right? The Old Testament says every time you sin, you should kill a goat and offer its blood on the altar. I don't have an altar. I don't have a temple. I don't have a priesthood outside of myself, outside of Christians in general, of which I am one, right? I am my own priest. I don't have anyone to take it to. I don't have anywhere to take it. I don't own any goats. What am I supposed to do about that? Also, it would probably be against the law. What am I supposed to do about that, right? Old Testament, yeah, you had blood sacrifices, but New Testament, you don't. Jesus is the blood sacrifice. And so you don't have to obey things in the same way when they are Old Testament versus New Testament. We can draw principles from the Old Testament, but we do not bind commands from the Old Testament. And that is very important. If you're reading the Old Testament and binding it like the New Testament, you kind of missed that there's a new covenant that happened. Jeremiah 31, there's a new covenant coming. It takes away the old one and it establishes a new one. There's also immediate context that you need to be considerate of. Not just the general historical context or the testamental context, but the immediate context. If I'm reading Ephesians 1, the immediate context is Ephesians 1, or just Ephesians in general. It is the book that you are in. It is the chapter that you are in. If you're reading Ephesians 2 and verse 9, we were not saved by works so that anyone could boast from them. You need to take in context Ephesians 2 and verse 10, which is, but we are made to work, right? It's not that our works save us, but we are made to do good works. It's not that good works are irrelevant. Actually, good works are very relevant. They are part of the workmanship of God. It's a sign that we're actually doing the things that we're supposed to be doing. And so you have to take immediate context into account, right? If you're dealing with one verse, you need to consider the verse before and the verse after, and the section before and the section after, because that informs your interpretation. You need to know the book as a whole, right? Matthew is a book that is split into, there are 5 discourses. There are 5 times Jesus speaks, primarily, and there are interluding narratives in between those. Jesus opens with the Sermon on the Mount, Matthew 5, 6, and 7. Jesus closes with Matthew, with the address to primarily the Pharisees and the Sadducees, Matthew 23, 24, and 25. In the Sermon on the Mount, he's working through those chapters on how you should live. In chapters 23 through 25, he's working on how you should not live. Chapter 23, don't be like the scribes and the Pharisees. Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, because of all these things. Chapter 24 is, look, there are a lot of people who think the destruction of, who are looking forward to the end of the world, but I tell you, there's a destruction of Jerusalem you really need to avoid. Don't be like those people who are blind to it. Chapter 25, don't be people who are blind to the end of the world either. The parable of the 10 virgins, who 5 of them prepared for the end. They brought extra oil for their lamps, and 5 of them didn't. And so 5 of them, the ones who didn't, were left out of the party, and they didn't get to celebrate with God at the end. The people who, Lord, Lord, did we not prophesy in your name and cast out demons in your name and perform many wonders in your name? And the answer is, no. The answer is like, yeah, you did, but what does that mean? Right? You didn't prepare for the end. And so he's telling you how to live in chapters 5, 6, and 7. He's telling you how not to live in chapters 23, 24, and 25. The beginning and the end. Those are parallels. And so you need to, when you're reading 23 through 27, or 23 through 25 of Matthew, you should be reflecting on chapters 5 through 7, because that's how that works. The other narratives are the other sections are chapter 10, where Jesus is calling his disciples, chapter 10, where Jesus is calling his disciples, chapter 13, which are the parables, 7 different parables, starting with the parable of the sower. It's the sower, and then the tares and the wheat, and then 5 others after that. And then chapter 18 is the 4th one, where he's talking about how to deal with other people. He's instructing his disciples on how to deal with others. In general, you have an introduction to the kingdom in 5 through 7. You have a chapter 10 is the commands for the disciples to go out and do good publicly. Chapter 13 is the centerpiece of the book. It's the center of the outline, which is the parables. Here is what the kingdom of heaven is like. The kingdom of heaven is like a man who went out into the field. The kingdom of heaven is like a pearl, which a guy found and then sold everything to go and buy. The kingdom of heaven is like a treasure in the field. The kingdom of heaven is like all these different things. That's the point of Matthew. That's the central point. And unless you have the context of the book, you've kind of missed that chapter 13 is the central point. Chapter 18 parallels chapter 10. It's about fixing internal problems among disciples, not just chapter 10's fixing external problems. And then chapters 23 through 25, again, parallel chapter 5 through 7 and teach you a bunch of ways not to live. Immediate context is important, because if you miss that those are all parallels, then you're also going to miss that in a lot of ways the stories in between those are also parallels, and they help you to inform your interpretation of what's actually going on. It also helps when you are aware of the immediate genre that you're in. A book of history is not a book of poetry, and you need to actually consider that. We'll talk about that in a bit at the beginning of, I think, next session. But the idea that you could just sit down and read the Bible and the Bible is all the same is kind of stupid, right? Prophecy is not poetry, is not history, is not wisdom literature, is not an epistle, is not a biography, an autobiography, which is what the Gospels are. These are all different. And if you read them the same, then you're going to miss a bunch of stuff. Poetry is very figurative. It's very metaphorical. But if you read it as very metaphorical, and you read history the same way as very, very metaphorical, then you'll believe none of the history ever happened when it clearly happened. The history is very literal. But then if you take the history's literality and read that into the Psalms and try and make them super literal, And it's like, God has forsaken me. Has he? Well, no, not really, because the point of Psalm 22 is actually God hasn't forsaken me. I feel this way, but he hasn't. That is not literal. My God, why have you forsaken me? That is a metaphor. Of course, that's also a question of interpretation. So, are you starting to realize how complicated this can get? Again, I'm not really sure how much I will be able to cover in class on Sunday, but I think I'll at least be able to do the next section, so we'll need to cover that a little bit. One last thing to do, if you've ever heard the word hermeneutics before, hermeneutics is basically a method of interpretation. If you've ever had one of those, I'm sure I have one somewhere, a systematic theology book, which is kind of like breaking down how does these things fit together. What is my method of interpretation? That's very similar to what that is. Hermeneutics basically boiled down to three things. My old mentor back when I was training, he would address it in this way. What does the text say? We have to know what the text actually says instead of just you can't just read Genesis and then start interpreting it from my personal life as a Christian in 2026. We have to know what the text says. We have to know what the text means for them, and then we have to know what the text means for me. A lot of people, they start to read the Bible, and they like to get to that third point. What does that text mean to me? And they like to make it personal application, and they like to make everything about themselves. No. That is the third step. And unless you know what the text says, and unless you know how other people throughout all of time have heard the text, you're not going to make a good or truthful application to yourself. What does the text mean to me is a third issue that you get to after you understand what it says and what it means in general. So that's what hermeneutics does. It's a reminder that you need to stick to that process, because skipping steps means you're going to skip something. If I don't read what the text says and I just jump to what it means, I have no idea what it means because I don't know what it says. If I do know what it says, but I don't know how they would have heard it, and I just know what it means for me, I've probably misapplied what it means to me. If I don't know how they heard it, I don't really know what was taught. And so whatever application I make is naturally suspect because I don't actually know what it means. That's the first section, is we need to be dealing with interpretation. What is interpretation and how does it work? That is all the first line in my outline. Second thing we should talk about is translations. And I'll try to keep this relatively brief. Hey, so welcome to me. This is the addendum, the Sunday afternoon edition. You might notice I'm in church clothes more than whatever I was wearing before, if you're watching the video. So originally this video covered the first couple of topics we had. We were talking about essentially context and, catching some things in context, being careful how you interpret things. And then I went ahead, I thought I would do at least some extent in the Sunday morning class. I thought I would get into the idea of translations and what translations you should be thinking about or be aware of as we were going. I just taught class this morning and did not touch translations in the slightest. And so I don't exactly remember my last words. I'm going to cut those things out, and then next week we'll pick up with a talk on what translations are and, kind of how you use those, and then we'll move on into something else. After that, we'll be looking at Old Testament narratives after that. And so, I said, I think at the beginning of this video, I'm not exactly sure how much I'm going to be able to cover. This is one of those times where I covered a whole extra topic on the video and did not get to it in person, so we'll just kind of adjust the schedule for that. Sorry if that makes the ending of this abrupt, but you are the secondary audience, and tough. I guess I'll see you next time. Next week, I will be preaching on something. Monday will be something. Monday will be whatever I'm preaching on Sunday morning. Wednesday will be the translations, and then into a little bit of the Old Testament narratives maybe. And then the Friday morning will be speaking from the next section of the Sermon on the Mount, although you have one section to go this Friday before we actually get to the next thing. So yeah, that's confusing enough. Terrible. I'm scatterbrained. It is Sunday afternoon, and I'm currently busy. So I will see you then.